The Jeffrey Epstein scandal shocked the modern world, exposing secret abuse hidden behind wealth and power. But what if I told you nearly a century earlier, during the chaos of the British general strike of 1926, equally horrifying sexual practices spread in the shadows of protest and poverty? Imagine a society torn apart, workers clashing with the state, and in the midst of the unrest, dark scandals of exploitation unfolding in brothels, boarding houses, and even union halls. Just as Epstein manipulated those trapped by circumstance, elites and opportunists during the strike preyed on the vulnerable. This is not the history you were taught in school. It is a tale of lust, fear, humiliation, and domination buried under the dust of revolt. The year was 1926, and the world was at the height of the British general strike, an event that shook not only the labor movement, but also revealed a darker, hidden side to the era's industrial power struggles. Amid the labor disputes and political chaos, a web of sexual indulgences and forbidden practices began to surface, turning the Jazz Age into one of the most shocking periods in history. Much like the Harvey Weinstein scandal that exploded years later, the power dynamics of the time led to scandalous behavior, exploiting those who had little say in their fate. Imagine the intensity of that power struggle, but this time it's all tied to lust, manipulation, and secrecy that would have had even modern audiences gasping in disbelief. The British general strike of 1926 was about far more than just labor rights. It was about control, power, and hidden sexual manipulations. While millions fought for their voices, others were quietly surrendering to their forbidden desires in the dark corners of industrial Britain. The general strike of 1926 was the pinnacle of workers' struggle against the British government, but few know about the undercurrent of sexual exploitation tied to the men who led the revolution. With tensions high and politics at their peak, union leaders and high-ranking officials in the labor movement found themselves indulging in secret affairs with both workers and aristocrats alike. Behind closed doors, these leaders were not only fighting for worker rights, but were also engaged in forbidden sexual practices, the likes of which would have been impossible for most working-class men and women to imagine. The lust for power led them to abandon moral codes, creating situations where sex and dominance were intertwined with their political ambitions. Their actions were shrouded in secrecy, fueled by the ideal of strength and dominance, traits often found in sexual power dynamics. Much like the later scandals involving Harvey Weinstein, these figures used their positions of power to manipulate and control the very people they claimed to represent. For the few in the know, the sexual chaos unfolding was as much a battle for control as the strike itself. As the general strike paralyzed Britain, those caught in the machinery of labor politics often found themselves in unfamiliar territory. With mass gatherings, long meetings, and an overwhelming atmosphere of change, there was a palpable undercurrent of sexual tension. High-strung men and women, both laborers and wealthy elites, sought release from the overwhelming stress of the strike. In the bustling cities, smoke-filled rooms became places of negotiation, and not just for the workers. The aristocratic men who stood behind the labor movement's politics were all too eager to indulge in forbidden liaisons. It wasn't uncommon for the leaders of the strikes to seduce women who came seeking answers, promising them political favor in exchange for sexual favors. Much like modern-day scandals, the balance of power during the general strike heavily influenced personal interactions. The weakened state of many laborers due to harsh living conditions and political turmoil meant they often succumbed to the demands of these influential men. The sexual manipulation of young women by powerful figures became a hidden part of the political agenda. As the strike escalated, it became evident that the cost of political power came with dangerous consequences. While workers stood firm on the picket lines, their leaders, behind the scenes, indulged in sexual escapades with those they sought to control. The manipulation of sexual power was not just about dominance, but about conquest, the conquest of their own positions within the movement and their influence over others. In these circles, women were seen not as political equals, but as objects to be used. And the victims were often young, vulnerable and eager for a change in their oppressive lives. While the men fought for economic rights, they simultaneously exploited the very people they claimed to defend. The overlap between political ambition and sexual dominance became an ugly part of the fabric of the British general strike. Their actions mirrored Harvey Weinstein's reign of terror, where women were forced to trade sex for favors in a world dominated by powerful men. This pattern of sexual manipulation would go on to repeat itself in modern-day scandals, showing that sexual exploitation, particularly by those in power, is a long-standing issue in history. When the British general strike came to an end, it wasn't just the political system that had to rebuild. The damage done to the personal lives of those involved was just as significant. The secrets of sexual exploitation within the strike movement were buried deep beneath the surface, but whispers about infidelities, abuse, and manipulation continued to linger. Over time, as society began to recover from the strike's aftermath, some of the women who had been manipulated and abused by their powerful leaders began to speak out. The stories of sexual coercion and betrayal came to light, shedding light on the dark side of the movement. Much like modern-day whistleblowers, these women became symbolic of a system gone wrong, where sexual power was used as a tool for political gain. In many ways, the general strike became a precursor to later sexual scandals, with its legacy of manipulation still felt today. From Harvey Weinstein to Bill Clinton, the history of sexual coercion and exploitation by those in power continued to repeat itself, mirroring the horrors of the past. These women had to fight not only for their political rights, but for their personal dignity as well. As the general strike ended and its sexual aftermath began to surface, new scandals continued to unravel across history. The manipulation of power for sexual gain didn't end in 1926. Much like modern-day scandals, the struggles for political domination and sexual control remain just as prevalent today. The next story unfolds. As the world slowly recovered from the devastation of the Great War, the British general strike of 1926 loomed large in the public consciousness. The economic and political tensions of the time intertwined with passions and desires, giving rise to shocking behaviors that pushed society's moral boundaries in unthinkable ways. The British general strike of 1926 saw millions of workers rise up, demanding better conditions and a fairer wage. The unrest stirred powerful emotions and led to an increase in illicit activities as the lines between authority and submission blurred. Workers, often pushed to the edge, found themselves in compromising situations, seeking solace in forbidden pleasures as a means of coping with their plight. Some resorted to chaotic, intense encounters that exposed the fragility of societal norms. This period of intense revolt was also a time of personal rebellion, where people used sex as an outlet to assert power over the system that oppressed them. In the shadow of the political chaos, London's underworld saw a boom in clandestine rendezvous, private gatherings, and secretive brothels. For many workers on strike, these were not just escapes, but expressions of autonomy. The pursuit of pleasure took precedence as they looked for control in a world they couldn't control. Tales of mistresses, lovers, and illicit encounters were common in the hidden corners of London, where sex was both an act of defiance and a desperate cry for freedom. The general strike provided an opportunity for those in power to indulge in their most forbidden desires, pushing the boundaries of decency in ways that would later be hidden behind the closed doors of history. The sexual exploits of the elite during the general strike were not confined to their private estates. Politicians and business tycoons who controlled the pulse of the nation were seen frequenting forbidden venues, engaging in practices that defied public decency. They used their influence and wealth to acquire pleasure in ways that were far beyond the reach of the striking workers. These experiences were often marked by extravagant and excessive indulgence, as they sought solace in the arms of mistresses and lovers during a time of national unrest. For them, the strike served as both the backdrop for scandal and a reminder of their ability to dominate both politically and sexually. In the heat of the general strike, passion and rebellion were not limited to political ideologies, but also infiltrated the personal lives of those involved. Sexual revolutions took place in quiet corners, with striking workers experimenting with their most intimate desires. The traditional norms of love and passion were swept aside by the intoxicating combination of power and defiance. Workers and their allies, consumed by their desires for both justice and satisfaction, indulged in acts of rebellion that were as much about asserting control as they were about fulfilling their deepest urges. During the British general strike, it wasn't just the government that was shaken, it was the very fabric of society that was tested, with passion and lust playing roles as significant as politics. But as the general strike moved towards its bitter end, the passion that had surged through the streets of London began to settle. In the wake of this chaotic, sexually charged moment, what would happen next? The unrest would lead to deeper consequences, some of which would shake even the most powerful people to their core. As the dust settled from the chaos of the general strike, the erotic and political tensions of the era took on even darker shades. In the aftermath, powerful elites and the oppressed working class alike faced consequences that would forever mark the history of the British general strike, where power, sex, and betrayal collided. The aftermath of the British general strike saw a fascinating contradiction within the elite class. While they held the power to crush the revolt, they were also haunted by desires that the public could never imagine. Political leaders, business moguls, and other influential figures engaged in affairs and illicit encounters, often right under the noses of their families. The strike, a symbol of the workers' revolt, was not just an economic and political statement, but also a sexual one. The elite's need for control in the political sphere bled into their personal lives, leading to acts of lust and domination that only further highlighted their power imbalance. The tension between these leaders' public personas and their private indulgences was one of the most terrifying consequences of the general strike, as their sexual practices came to define their political ideologies, fueling the desire to assert control not just over the workers, but over their own desires. These secret encounters often left a trail of scandal, as those in power sought both pleasure and relief from the pressures of their positions. The aftermath of the general strike was more than just a political defeat. It was a sexual one as well. The betrayal of workers by their own leaders and comrades reflected the sexual power dynamics that had been at play throughout the strike. Many workers who had fought so passionately for their rights found themselves betrayed by those they trusted the most. It was during this time of emotional and physical vulnerability that the most shocking and forbidden encounters took place. Betrayal in both the political and sexual spheres was rampant, as strikes often led to intimate entanglements that blurred the lines between personal and political. In the aftermath, the consequences of such acts left behind a scarred and disillusioned society, with many workers unable to reconcile their political victories with the emotional damage that had been done. Sex, which had been a powerful form of rebellion during the strike, became a tool of manipulation and exploitation, as those who once fought for justice found themselves caught in the very systems they sought to overthrow. The general strike had sparked a revolution in more ways than one, leaving behind a legacy of betrayal, lust, and power that would continue to haunt Britain for years to come. The story of betrayal, passion, and sexual power wasn't over yet. As the dust settled from the strike, the consequences of these forbidden encounters began to take shape. What would become of the broken workers, and what would be the ultimate fallout of their rebellion? The truth is even more shocking. As the workers continued to face oppression, the powerful elite moved in the shadows, indulging in acts that would forever stain the legacy of the general strike. Their desires became more twisted, their power more dangerous. This section explores how sexual manipulation and betrayal took hold in the aftermath. After the British general strike of 1926, the ruling elite of Britain were left with the daunting task of reasserting their control over both the nation's workforce and their own personal desires. Behind the facades of political meetings, these powerful individuals sought sexual pleasures that reflected their belief in total dominance. The elite's lust for control was not just seen on the streets, but also in the private realms of their bedrooms. Using their status and wealth, they sought to dominate the bodies of both men and women in sexually charged power dynamics. Whether through secret affairs, blackmail, or covert sexual engagements, these figures leveraged their influence to satisfy their carnal desires. Often, their acts of sexual dominance served to reinforce the hierarchical power structures that sustained their political and economic status. The elite's need for submission, whether physical or emotional, mirrored their deep-seated need to control the working class, further exacerbating the divisions between the privileged and the oppressed. As they indulged in forbidden pleasures, they believed themselves untouchable, above the law and beyond reproach. These sexual manipulations were not just acts of pleasure, but powerful statements of authority. For the working-class individuals involved in the general strike, their sexual encounters often became an extension of their defiance. The general strike had been more than just a political movement. It had been a call for freedom, a demand for the dignity and autonomy that had long been denied to the working class. As these workers pushed against the oppressive forces that had ruled over them for generations, many found themselves engaging in sexual acts that broke the norms of their time. Some of these encounters became symbols of rebellion, with workers using sex as a weapon against their oppressors. It was a way for them to take back control of their bodies, to assert their right to pleasure and freedom. For some, these sexual engagements were not just physical acts, they were political statements. Love and lust became intertwined with the revolutionary spirit that fueled the strike. And for many, the personal liberation that came with these forbidden affairs served as a reminder of their ongoing struggle. These encounters, though passionate, often turned bitter as workers found themselves caught in a web of emotional complexity, unable to escape the consequences of their actions. Still, these sexual rebellions served as an enduring reminder of their fight for justice. The aftermath of the general strike left the workers' movement broken, but not without significant personal costs. Betrayal became a pervasive force, both politically and sexually. As workers and their allies faced the crushing weight of their defeat, many found that their sexual affairs and desires had led them into dangerous and compromising positions. The strike had encouraged alliances among the workers, but after the collapse of the movement, those alliances dissolved. What was once passionate resistance had turned into brutal manipulation. Sexual encounters became tools for power struggles within the ranks of the workers' own circles. Those who had once fought side by side began using intimate relationships to undermine each other. These acts of sexual betrayal were not limited to the workers themselves, but also involved their leaders, who were often seduced or coerced into compromising positions by the elite or rival factions. For some workers, the loss of political hope was mirrored by the destruction of their personal lives, as their sexual choices became the very means by which they were exploited. The general strike had ignited passions, but the aftermath showed that those passions were often manipulated for political gain. The conclusion of the general strike left Britain fractured, and the sexual dynamics of the time were forever altered. The elite, emboldened by their success in suppressing the workers, continued their indulgence in excessive power and pleasure. However, their actions did not come without consequences. The world was changing, and the rise of a more politically conscious and sexually liberated populace began to take hold. The fallout from the strike would lead to a society increasingly skeptical of the elite's grip on power. Though the workers had lost the political battle, the sexual revolutions they helped ignite would continue to spread throughout Europe. For the elite, however, the consequences were more personal. The emotional and psychological toll of their manipulations became apparent as they faced increasingly harsh scrutiny. The affair-filled lives of many high-ranking figures, once kept under wraps, began to surface, leading to a wave of scandals. The elite's sexual practices, once a symbol of their dominance, became a sign of their ultimate vulnerability. Meanwhile, the working class, though crushed, carried the scars of both their political and sexual struggles into future generations. The legacy of the general strike would live on in both the political sphere and the sexual liberation that would emerge from the ashes of defeat. The battle between the elites and the workers did not end with the collapse of the strike. As the scars of the rebellion remained, the sexual dynamics of the time continued to shape British society. What would become of the broken workers, and what secrets did the elite still keep hidden? The story isn't over yet. As the general strike faded into history, the secretive desires of the powerful continued to mold the sexual landscape of Britain. Corruption, greed, and lust intersected in ways that remained hidden to the public. The aftermath of the strike revealed an intricate web of deception. Now, let's uncover these buried truths. In the aftermath of the general strike, the elite class of Britain, though victorious, continued their indulgence in affairs that bordered on obsession. These illicit relationships, once behind closed doors, began to surface as political and personal dynamics shifted. The wealthy and powerful, who had successfully crushed the workers' rebellion, were not untouched by their own inner conflicts. The wealthy elite often used their political power to fuel their sexual escapades, using their influence to dominate those beneath them. These affairs were more than just personal indulgence. They were strategic. The affairs allowed these individuals to forge political alliances or keep opponents at bay. It was common for high-ranking officials to use sex as a bargaining chip, manipulating both their lovers and rivals alike. The power imbalance between the aristocracy and the workers left these elites with little regard for societal norms. In the decadent circles of the upper class, sex was both an act of pleasure and a game of dominance. This sexual manipulation of power allowed these individuals to maintain their status while simultaneously feeding into the chaos that plagued the working class. It was clear that the general strike had not only caused political upheaval, but had also given rise to even more intense sexual struggles among the privileged elite. The scandals that emerged in the wake of the general strike were not confined to the workers. The elite's hidden affairs began to leak into the public sphere, creating a wave of sensationalism. The once private lives of the wealthy and powerful were now subject to scrutiny as their sexual manipulations began to surface. These individuals, who had once held themselves above reproach, were suddenly vulnerable to the public's eye. Affairs that had once been conducted in secrecy were now the subject of gossip and scandal, with many of the most notorious politicians and businessmen exposed as hypocrites. These individuals, who had long used their power to exploit the working class, found themselves caught in the same webs of deception that they had woven for others. The exposure of these scandals was not just about infidelity or lust, it was about control. The sexual practices of the elite became a means by which they retained their dominance over the rest of society. As the public's curiosity about the private lives of these figures grew, so too did the realization that the same manipulation and coercion that had been used to suppress the workers were now being turned inward on the very people who had created the oppressive system. The elite's sexual scandals revealed a deep hypocrisy and fractured the image of respectability they had long held. The general strike and its aftermath left an indelible mark on British society, not just in terms of political and economic upheaval, but also in its influence on the sexual landscape. The sexual manipulation, exploitation, and scandals that emerged during and after the strike changed the way people viewed power, control, and intimacy. The working class may have lost the political battle, but the effects of their struggle reverberated through the elite's personal lives. For the working class, the general strike had been a call for freedom, a demand for recognition, and a cry against oppression. Though they had been defeated, Their defiance lingered in the form of hidden sexual rebellions and challenges to the old power structures. The elite, in turn, began to realize that their power was not as invulnerable as they had once believed. Their illicit relationships and manipulative behaviors not only caused harm to the working class, but also undermined the very institutions that had once upheld their superiority. The general strike's legacy, in part, became one of sexual rebellion, with the effects of the movement continuing to shape British society in ways that no one could have predicted. The tension between the ruling class and the workers persisted, and the sexual manipulations that had fueled the conflict remained a central part of the story. The political and sexual scandals that followed the general strike revealed more than just hypocrisy. It exposed the raw power dynamics that continued to shape Britain. As the elite continued to indulge in their desires, the workers were left to pick up the pieces. What came next would shake them all. After the general strike, the echoes of rebellion were felt across the British landscape. The undercurrent of power, lust, and manipulation became inescapable. But in the darkest corners of the aftermath, shocking secrets about the elite's depravity began to surface, revealing even deeper sexual exploits. Hold on as we unravel the next tale. As the general strike ended, the high society of Britain turned its attention back to their lavish lives, maintaining a hold over their wealth and influence. Yet beneath their respectable veneers, many were caught in sexual exploits that were as twisted as they were powerful. Within the aristocracy, sex became another tool of political control, used to assert dominance over others, particularly the working class, in more intimate and manipulative ways. The wealthy saw these affairs not just as mere indulgences, but as a form of dominance, cementing their position as rulers of society. In these sexual exploits, power and humiliation were inextricably linked. Politicians and businessmen frequently used their positions of influence to trap their partners in sexual scenarios that blurred the lines of consent, acting not only as lovers, but as puppet masters in the most intimate corners of their lives. These illicit relationships formed the backdrop of an even greater societal structure, one in which the workers' struggles against political oppression were met with exploitation and subjugation behind closed doors. For many of the wealthy, their lust-filled indulgences were seen as an extension of their dominance over the public and private spheres, ensuring that their status remained untouched. The betrayal within the British aristocracy in the wake of the general strike went beyond the realms of politics and economy. It took root in the most intimate corners of their lives. As the elite class sought to maintain control, they wove a complex web of lies and deception, using sexual relationships to keep the working class in check. Partners, wives, and mistresses were often treated as mere tools for the greater game of power, where betrayal was a constant companion. The aristocracy's personal lives were built on a foundation of lies, as many involved themselves in illicit affairs to maintain their power or gain further influence. These relationships were not born of passion, but of necessity, designed to manipulate emotions and control the narrative. Even those who seemed to be allies within the ruling class often found themselves betrayed as their sexual desires were exploited for political gain. The web of deception became so tangled that it was difficult to tell who was manipulating whom. The line between love, lust, and political maneuvering grew so thin that it became impossible for anyone within the aristocracy to truly trust one another. For many, these betrayals in the bedroom were just a reflection of the broader betrayals they imposed on the working class. Behind the lavish parties and luxurious lifestyles, the true cost of the elite's sexual exploits was being paid by those who had no choice but to bear the consequences. In the aftermath of the general strike, women of the working class were not the only ones being sexually exploited. The aristocracy, too, saw their women trapped in complex webs of power dynamics and sexual servitude. The mistresses, wives, and daughters of the wealthy were often coerced or manipulated into sexual relationships that served to secure political alliances, power, and control. For many of these women, their sexual autonomy was stripped away, replaced by a demand to perform for the needs of their male counterparts. The wives of powerful men found themselves caught in an endless cycle of appeasing their husbands' desires while simultaneously being used as pawns in the political games of the aristocracy. But it wasn't just the women in established marriages that were affected. Mistresses of influential men were often forced into positions of servitude where their physical bodies were seen as collateral for political advancement. These women were pressured to maintain their silence, as their very lives depended on keeping the secrets of their lovers. Even as these women held significant influence within their circles, they remained trapped in the shadows, controlled by the whims of powerful men who treated them as little more than sexual objects. It became clear that the power structures that existed in the post-strike world were not just about wealth and politics, but also about the control and commodification of women's bodies. Beyond the prying eyes of the public, a dark underworld of lust and scandal thrived within the secretive circles of Britain's elite. With the general strike fading into history, the political elite turned to their most secret desires, using power and wealth to engage in the most shocking sexual escapades. Hidden from the gaze of the common man, these activities were a constant reminder of the vast divide between the ruling class and the workers they had so brutally suppressed. In the shadows of their mansions and private estates, the elite found solace in dangerous and illicit affairs that challenged all norms of decency. These affairs were marked by manipulative games, as participants were lured into sexual exploitation under the guise of political necessity or affection. The elite didn't just engage in typical sexual relationships, they indulged in voyeuristic pleasures and sadistic encounters, often forcing others into these humiliating roles for the sake of their personal satisfaction. These sexual underworlds were not just an escape from the stresses of their ruling class duties, but also a reflection of their ability to control and dominate in the most intimate ways. The scandalous stories that emerged from this dark period were hushed up, kept behind locked doors and private clubs and secretive gatherings. What remained were rumors and whispers, fragments of the sordid deeds that had unfolded, hidden away from the world. As the sexual manipulation within the elite continued, the consequences of their actions began to resurface. Their indulgence in illicit affairs and power struggles revealed a deep corruption at the heart of their empire. What followed was a new chapter in the ongoing battle between the rulers and the ruled. What would come next? As the echoes of the general strike grew fainter, the consequences of the sexual manipulation by the elite became even more profound. The webs of power, lust, and betrayal continued to expand. The final chapter of this sordid story reveals the aftermath of their reign and the powerful forces that continue to shape the future. In the aftermath of the general strike, the unchecked sexual excesses of the aristocracy began to unravel their dominance. Once revered for their power and wealth, the elite class found themselves mired in scandals that were too explosive to ignore. The public's view of the aristocracy, once untouchable, began to shift as rumors of their sexual exploits and corrupt political dealings spread. The very fabric of their power was no longer as secure as it once seemed. Men and women who had once used their sexual prowess to manipulate and control found themselves on the receiving end of public scrutiny. Some aristocrats were forced to defend their actions, others were forced into public disgrace, and a few even faced legal consequences for their illicit affairs. The political and sexual manipulation that had once ensured their dominance now began to tear at the fabric of their empire. Many of the scandalous affairs that had occurred behind closed doors were brought to light, forcing the wealthy to confront the consequences of their actions. For the first time in generations, the aristocracy's power was no longer absolute, and their sexual exploits became an emblem of their eventual downfall. What had once been an unspoken privilege was now an albatross around their necks, and they could no longer hide behind their wealth and influence. As the aristocracy's influence dwindled, the political landscape of Britain began to shift. The aftermath of the general strike revealed the fragile nature of the power structures that had existed for centuries. The sexual manipulation and exploitation by the wealthy had caused a ripple effect, one that could not be ignored. The public, once subjugated and disempowered, began to demand change. The political ramifications of the aristocracy's excesses were far-reaching. Their sexual relationships and political alliances were no longer viewed with admiration. They were seen as the very cause of the inequalities that had plagued the working class. For the first time, the people's voice was heard, and their demands for justice were backed by the growing knowledge of the aristocracy's corruption. Political leaders who had once aligned themselves with the ruling elite began to distance themselves, recognizing that the old ways of power were no longer sustainable. The political structures that had been in place for centuries now appeared outdated, and the tide began to turn toward a new era of political representation for the common people. The sexual manipulation that had been used to control the working class now became a symbol of everything that was wrong with the old order, and the new political revolution was set in motion. As the scandals of the aristocracy continued to unfold, a new force began to rise in Britain: the working class. The general strike, combined with the public revelations of the elite's sexual and political manipulations, sparked a shift in the balance of power. The once subjugated workers, who had been at the mercy of the wealthy for so long, began to demand their rights. No longer willing to tolerate the injustices imposed by the aristocracy, the working class fought back, determined to reclaim their power and dignity. The public's growing awareness of the sexual exploitation carried out by the elite fueled the fire of revolt. The workers no longer saw themselves as powerless victims of an unjust system. They saw themselves as agents of change, capable of challenging the very foundations of the aristocracy's rule. Their struggle became more than just about fair wages and better working conditions. It became a fight for the dismantling of an old, corrupt system that had used power, lust, and manipulation to control them. The sexual exploitation of the elite was now seen as just one part of the greater injustice they had faced for generations. As the working class found their voice, the aristocracy's reign over British society began to weaken, and a new, more egalitarian future started to take shape. The downfall of the British aristocracy marked the end of an era. The once untouchable figures who had manipulated both politics and sexuality to maintain their power were now viewed with contempt. The scandalous affairs, the coercion, and the political exploitation had left an indelible mark on society. The aristocracy's loss of power was not merely about the end of an elite class. It symbolized the beginning of a more transparent, accountable society. The legacy of their sexual exploits and corrupt practices became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the dangers of unchecked power and the consequences of manipulating others for personal gain. As the working class rose to power, the sexual scandals of the aristocracy were revisited time and time again, becoming the basis for a new understanding of justice and equality. What had once been hidden behind closed doors was now in the public eye, leading to reforms in both the political and social systems. The aristocracy's sexual manipulation became a symbol of the old world, a world that was no longer fit for the modern age. In its place, a new era of democracy and equal rights began to take root, and the lessons learned from the aristocracy's downfall shaped the future of British society. The working class had reclaimed power, and the sexual exploitation of the elite would never again be allowed to go unchallenged. As the sexual scandals of the aristocracy continued to reverberate throughout British society, the echoes of their downfall became a powerful reminder. The shift in power dynamics was irreversible, but what came next? Would the working class continue to rise, or would new challenges emerge to threaten their newfound power?